Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Libby Hoffman. And she's here to share with us her new book, The Answers Are There, Building Peace from the Inside Out. Wise woman and practical visionary, Libby Hoffman has worked more than 30 years at the nexus of international peace building, organizational development, spirituality, and social transformation. She is the president of Catalyst for Peace, a private foundation she founded in 2003 to grow a new architect for peace, one that works from the inside out, where those most impacted by violence and war lead in building peace and restoring social wholeness. So let's welcome to the show, Libby Hoffman.
Thank you, Marianne. It's such a pleasure to be here.
My goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. What was even the inspiration to be on the path of peace?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I think at some level, I feel like I didn't have another choice. When I was younger, I had dreams of being Secretary of State. I was always drawn into the international arena. And what I came to, and parallel to that, I've always had this deep faith conviction and a sense of impulsion to live the very best that I could, and that I knew out into the world, that I was part of something much bigger than myself. And those things wove together for me, that sort of global heart for humanity and deep faith convictions into it felt like my work and my commitment to peace was really about the space where I could weave my deepest convictions into service for the world. At a big picture level, it feels like that's been sort of the impulses in my life.
Well, I'm so glad it is, because we're looking at peace in a different way. I think a lot of times when people look at global peace, it could be such a mixed bag. They don't even know where to start.
Yeah, I think that's true. It can be overwhelming. And although I feel like I've always had this calling to work in the international arena, I majored in political science and Russian studies when I was in college, and then did my graduate work in international relations. So that's always been a particular calling. But what I have found in my over 35 years in working in international peace is that actually there's a way in which the essence of the work is that which happens at a very inner level. And the work that we do individually and internally is the nexus of what really supports transformation in the world. There isn't so much a separation between the two of those. And that's what I found over the course of my career in this work, and trying to make spaces where that was obvious, to invite other people into that. I think so much of the work of international relations in general and international peace, kind of in the official ways, like in the ways that we're taught in school, it ignores the individual. And I don't think the world will allow us to do that anymore. We have to be and bring our full selves, and we have to work in ways that invite people to bring their whole selves. At one level, it makes it more complicated, and at another level, it makes it easier.
So why don't you share a little bit about your work in Sierra Leone with us? What was it like? What's the culture and community like there?
Well, if I can back up just a little bit, if it's all right to just give a little bit of a big picture context here. Because I'd love to just share a little bit about how I came to work in Sierra Leone, and then talk about the culture and the context specifically. I had been a political science professor, teaching in international relations at a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, and left teaching because I was always more oriented towards activism, and wanted to really do the work instead of just being focused on the teaching and the research. And I had the opportunity to my focus in particular was peace building and conflict resolution. And what I saw at that time was, the Cold War had ended, but we hadn't really discovered new ways of solving like the nature of conflict had changed, but not our tools for how we dealt with it. And more conflicts were civil wars that involved ordinary people. And yet none of our tools for building peace after war really engaged people. And it felt like this wasted resource. And what I was most interested in was figuring out, how do we create space for the people that are most impacted by war to be the ones who get to lead in the work of rebuilding the peace after the war. So this was kind of the work that I most yearned to do. And through a series of events, I came to be able to direct a foundation called that I named Catalyst for Peace, to be able to not just be engaging in this work, but to be funding it. And so the Catalyst for Peace became the vehicle through which, as a foundation, that I wanted to make this contribution, where I could figure out over the course of time, how do we create space for ordinary people to lead in the work of building peace. And I had been working in other parts of Africa and had been stunned by the work that was happening at the local level in communities, in particular in northern Uganda, where there had been a long-term civil war. And the work that was happening at the local community level was stunning. And I wanted to find ways to create spaces like that in other parts of the world. And I teamed up with a documentary photographer and journalist friend of mine, Sarah Terry, who had just come back from Sierra Leone and was telling me about these amazing stories of forgiveness that she was encountering there. And so we started a project to gather some of these stories. And when she was there, she met a Sierra Leonean human rights advocate, John Cocker. And John had been leading efforts in Sierra Leone during the Civil War to call for peace, to get the stories out about what was happening in Sierra Leone, and then to try to lead initiatives as the war was drawing to an end, to ensure that that everybody had a chance to reconcile, to build healing processes that started, and that was. So Sarah met him, and he was about ready to give up on because even the formal processes after Sierra Leone Civil War ended. It was an 11-year civil war where over 50,000 people were killed, and 250,000 women experienced sexual violence. 2/3 of the population was displaced. Communities were torn apart, and people lived next. Amputation became a tool of war. It was a civil war that was known for almost cultivating new levels of atrocity. And yet, John Cocker had this vision that his country, that people were ready to reconcile, and that they still had a rich culture and rich resources in their people and their community to heal from the war. And he wanted a space to do that. But the official international processes to end the war ignored ordinary people, ignored the communities. They didn't reach the people most impacted. And so as my colleague Sarah was talking with him, he spilled out this vision for how it could be different. And Sarah knew that that was completely in sync with my vision, and connected me and John, and we spoke, and the commonalities in our vision just so aligned. And we came together to work to create a program that started from the assumption that the people and community most impacted by the war have the answers, that they can lead in building the peace after the war. And in fact, when they do, incredible things will be possible. And that brings me, that's a long way around your, it brings me to your question, Marianne, which is, what is the culture? And one of the critical things that I've seen in Sierra Leone is there's this beautiful culture of community. And there's an understanding that community is this living entity in and of itself. And it's part of what establishes people's identity. And one of the most powerful places that we saw that was around, or implications of that, is it opens up a different understanding of justice. And this is what I saw, the international community as it thought about how do we help bring justice after this gruesome civil war? So the standard international concept that is justice is about punishment and separation. You identify the people most responsible, you take them out of the community and you punish them. And that's what the special court that tried the 13 people most responsible for the war, deemed most responsible, did. But the reality was, if you ask ordinary Sierra Leonean people, what does justice look like? For them, justice isn't about punishment and separation. It's about a restoration of wholeness. And Marianne, the idea that that's based on is this understanding that if I hurt you, I haven't just hurt you, I've hurt your whole family and I've hurt the whole community. And so there's a collective understanding of it. And family is defined in that context very broadly, not just biological family, the people that you live in a house with, but your whole community, really. And then, so you don't have justice until the community is made whole again. If the community is broken, then justice is about making the community whole again. And that includes both the victim and the perpetrator. And this is such a powerful idea. And it was really what grounded our work with Fumble Talk, which means family talk. And that was this idea that Sierra Leoneans adopted. Fumble Talk is sort of their cultural tool. We solve problems through conversation with the family. And again, family broadly defined. And there's this tradition of coming together in the community around a bonfire to talk about problems and solve them through conversation. And so given this culture of community, this understanding of justice as about restoration of wholeness, and this process of coming together to talk together to solve your problems, that sort of became this rich cultural resource to use to help people in community heal even from some of the most egregious atrocities, like what they had experienced in the Civil War. And people often talk about Sierra Leone as having a culture of forgiveness. And that's true. And where that comes from, it's rooted in this idea of community, of wholeness of community. And so they literally, most Sierra Leoneans most villages in Sierra Leone don't have electricity or running water, and they operate on subsistence farming. And the road networks that were there before the war were largely destroyed by the war. So the communities are really isolated in a lot of ways and very dependent on what they grow themselves, what they can do themselves for their own survival. And so if the whole community isn't working together, people can't survive. I mean, it's just, so they need to, when there's a rift in the community, they need everybody working for the community in order to survive. And so when there's a rift, they have to deal with it. And there's this understanding that, I think that runs in parallel to this idea of community wholeness, of the wholeness of community. And so there's a real desire to, if you have done something wrong, to apologize and to be forgiven and to be brought back into your community. And if you have been harmed, to repair that wound requires your whole community to support you in doing that. And so there's this beautiful tradition of coming together as a community to address the challenges that any of your members have faced or that the community as a whole has faced. And, John and I decided just to take that seriously enough to actually build a whole reconciliation program around it, a national reconciliation program rooted in really understanding and celebrating this value of community.
So when we talk about reconciliation and let's say someone needs to be made whole, what would that look like in these communities?
Well, the way we designed the Fumble Talk program, the heart of it was around this community bonfire. And again, that draws from Sierra Leone's culture and tradition. When you don't have electricity, and you when you go outside at night and it's dark, you gather around the fire. That's the place where you can see each other. And that was a place where people would come together at the end of the day to talk. And so we built a reconciliation program around that culture and that practice. Now, one of the things that sounds easier when you just say it like that, and the reality is, so much of that culture had been destroyed by the war in Sierra Leone. So it actually took a lot of work to get there. So I'll talk about the work of how to do it. But just first, I can describe a typical reconciliation bonfire. And maybe I'll tell the story about one in particular, which is in Dabu in Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone's in West Africa, and it's bordered by Liberia and Guinea. And in the far eastern corner of Sierra Leone, which was the place where the war started, there was one village named Dabu, and it had been a rebel stronghold during the Civil War. And what that meant is that the rebels came and set up their base there, and half the village fled. And the people that stayed either were considered to be rebels or rebel collaborators. And so after the war, people moved back, and there was like this wall of distrust between anybody who had stayed during the war and people had left. And people were literally living next door to people who might have burned down their house or killed their partner or their child, or raped them, or forced them to hurt somebody. And they had never talked about what happened. And this was definitely the case in Dabu. And Fumble Talk worked with them over the course of 3 months to prepare for this bonfire. And what they did, and they went around and worked with the people to bring. Well, let me just share about the bonfire itself, and then, as I said, I'll go into talking a little bit about what it took to make it happen. But in this bonfire, it's a village of a few houses and huts, mostly with thatched roofs, some with zinc roofs, around sort of a dirt center that had a community center in that had gotten burned down during the war. And so right next to that clearing, they built a bonfire, and the town had gathered wood for weeks to be able to do this. And people from the neighboring towns came, and as it got dark, and they started playing the drums and dancing as people gathered, and they sat around the bonfire. And as it got darker, one of the leaders from that district and from that community came. He was a really respected chief, came forward and just set the stage for everybody, and invited everybody that had gathered and said, we suffered during the war, and what Fumble Talk wants, and again, Fumble Talk means family talk, which is this tradition that they were drawing upon. They wanted people to come together and talk about what had happened during the war. What happened to you? What did you do to another? This is an invitation. You won't be prosecuted, to tell your stories and to apologize and to forgive. And just really reiterated how everybody could come together and share their stories, and how they wouldn't be able to move forward as a community until they did. Because again, this at this point was 7 or 8 years after the war, and nobody had talked about what happened to them. And so after the chief opened the floor, a young man came forward right away, eagerly. And he stood up, and it turns out his name was Michael. And he said, during the war, I was conscripted by the rebels and ordered to come into this village and secure food for our rebels. And another family fled, and they captured her daughter and thought that they had buried the food, and ordered the daughter to tell them where they had buried the food. And She refused, and he said he was ordered by his officer to tie her to a chair and to beat her until she could reveal where she'd hidden the food, and she didn't, and he ended up beating her to death. I mean, this was a horrible story. And he wanted to apologize to the mother of the child. And so the chief asked, is the mother of this daughter of this young girl here? And a woman stood up, and her name was Marianne, and she came forward into the center of the bonfire and said, "That's me." And Michael bowed to her in deep apology. He said he didn't want to do that. He felt like he had been forced, and he was sorry. And he bowed in this deep bow, which is a Sierra Leone sort of symbol of you're humbling yourself. And she touched the top of his head and accepted his apology, and they embraced and moved to the side of the bonfire together, and the community broke out in dancing. And several over the course of the evening, probably 10 or more of these stories happened. Astonishing. Any one of them is astonishing in its own right, but taken together, it's breathtaking. And as I sat watching these ceremonies, I was stunned at what was unfolding in front of me. And we were filming this as it was happening, and I had a chance. We had a chance to interview Michael and Marianne the next day, so learned more about the backstory. And it turns out that they lived next door to each other. Next door in this small village. I mean, there were probably 15 to 20 houses in the village, and they lived next door to each other, and they had never talked about what happened. And Mariama, when we asked her how she could forgive him, she looked at us as if, how could you not? How could you not? And she said she knew that they needed to forgive each other in order for their town to be able to move forward, and develop. And, she said it won't bring her daughter back, and she put her hands on her shoulder as she was saying this. She said, but before I held the grief of my daughter's death by myself with her fingertips touching her shoulders. And then she opened her arms and made this wide gesture. And she said, but now my community is holding it with me. And so that's the larger context, is that she felt that this community gathered in hearing this horrible story of heartbreak, was holding her grief with her. They would help her in the ways that she needed help. They would ensure that Michael didn't do anything like this again. They would help hold him accountable. And there's something about this culture of acknowledging an apology and forgiveness in front of the whole community that was this really cleansing and transformative space. And that, on the one hand, it sounds astonishing, but on the other hand, that's what their culture said would help them move on even after egregious harm. And like Mariama said, it didn't bring her daughter back, but it did restore their relationship. And Michael would do whatever he could to help her with chores. For example, this young girl who would have been old enough to really help with the household chores, and wasn't there. So he made an effort to carry water for her, to help with the farming, or whatever he could do to support it, repaired their relationship. And in the course of the bonfire, when Michael had testified, maybe 10 or so other pairs of people had come forward to testify. And all of these horrors of what had happened in the war, the community was able to acknowledge them, to create a safe container where they could do that, to apologize, and to begin the process of moving on. So these are astonishing stories of forgiveness and acknowledgement and apology. And they speak to the internal understanding of the power of community. Now, it also is important to say that it took about 3 to 4 months to prepare Dabu for this ceremony. It wasn't like it just happened overnight. And that's because the way that we worked with Fumble Talk was to not come in and sort of host this process for them, but to create the space where they could lead it themselves, to be inviting them into working together, and into drawing on their culture and drawing on their tradition and doing the planning themselves, because then you're re-knitting the fabric of the community. And the bonfire itself was the beginning, not the end of the process. So it brought these things that were like festering wounds out into the open for the community to deal with them. It allowed people to begin to repair their relationships, and the community as a whole to work forward together. And so after that ceremony, then the community engaged in months of ongoing collective activity, again facilitated by Fumble Talk, by our work, where it was really designed to cement what had begun in the bonfire process, so they could do work together on a community farm, which was a process that they had had before the war, but had been dormant since the war. Victims and perpetrators working side by side, we had soccer matches where they could play soccer together again, and just to normalize the process parallel to the bonfire. And it happened the next day after the bonfire ceremony was a cleansing ceremony where the community came together, and they have a tradition of communicating with their ancestors that had gone dormant since the war and before the war, actually. And they came together to revitalize these processes and traditions, and to come together to ask their ancestors forgiveness, and to go through a ceremonial cleansing process individually and for the community. And doing that, re-engaging their culture, was an important part of that process. It was like creating the context that allowed them to move forward together. And that reclaiming the culture, taking that culture seriously, was an important part of how we wanted to work and how we wanted to structure the reconciliation process. And that goes back to, it exists in contrast to the major international justice processes, which didn't recognize the value of culture. People in Sierra Leone would describe how, whether it was religious missionaries or colonialists, or even in its more recent, people coming in with non-governmental organizations to try to help humanitarian work, ignored and devalued the local people and local culture. And people felt that. And they would describe this Fumble Talk process as the first process that had taken their culture and their capacity seriously. And it all centered around community. How do you build community and strengthen the community container? Because when the community is made whole again, then they are capable of doing tremendous things, healing from the wounds of the war and beginning to work together to take their ongoing economic development needs into consideration, and to begin to meet their own needs themselves. And they could rediscover that as they were connected as a community.
I find that fascinating how that all comes together. And it sounds like there are a lot of people who have really good intentions, but the community isn't feeling like their voice is heard.
Exactly right. And that is one of my favorite stories actually was, it was on my very first visit to Sierra Leone, and this was in March of 2008. And we went to a community called Amanoa to do a consultation. When Fumble Talk works in a community, the first thing they do is they bring together all of the community leaders and do consult and make sure that they want them to come in and work. And Manoa at that time was an 11-hour drive from the capital city of Freetown. And then a 2-hour, another 2-hour drive after that, part of which was on a pole ferry across a river that didn't have a bridge. So it was not an easy place to get to at that time. The roads are a little bit better now, fortunately. But at this consultation, Fumble Talk went and said, okay, you have resources, you have culture. How do you want to reconcile? Do you want to reconcile? How do you want to reconcile? What resources do you already have? And how can we walk with you in that process? That was kind of their standard approach. And this community elder stood up and he said, this is the first time that anybody has ever asked us what we wanted. And he recited this several 100-year history. Said first first the Christians came and they said, no, your culture is bad. You need Christianity. And then the Muslims came and they said, no, that's haram. You need Islam. And then the British came. It's a former British Empire, British colony. You need, your culture is backwards. You need our civilization. And then the war came and that destroyed everything anyway. And then the humanitarian organizations came and, and basically said, we'll help you. But nobody asked what they wanted or what they already had or acknowledged what was already there. He said, this is the first time anybody has valued our culture and asked us what we wanted. And it's so easy. There is this reality that you're in a community with no electricity, no water, that has with very low levels of traditional literacy, and this legacy of civil war. There are a lot of needs and there are a lot of challenges, and without meaning to diminish that. And yet, as my colleague John would say all of the time, the people themselves are an incredible resource. The culture itself is an incredible resource. And instead of going in and saying, we've got the answers and we'll come and help you, we'll fix your problems, actually recognizing that the answers are there. And that's the title of my book, The Answers Are There. And when you see the answers are there, that the people in communities themselves have the answers to the problems that they face. And the work of outsiders isn't to fix or to save, but to go in and see that potential and to invite it forward and to acknowledge it and to build upon it and to help it grow and magnify the good that's there. That requires a completely different way of working as an outsider. And it's totally different from the mainstream humanitarian system. And the metaphor that we use, and this is something that I learned again from my colleague, John, if you look at the community itself, whether it's Dabu or Manawa or any of the other communities in Sierra Leone where we visited, it's like it's a cup. So the community is a cup, whatever problems it's facing, whether it's lack of education or healthcare or recovery from war, poverty, the aid system, humanitarian aid system is like a bottle of water. And the idea, the aid just sort of pours the water in the bottle, pours water into the cup of the community. Only when the water is poured in, it goes right through. Why? Because the cup itself is broken. And so if the water pouring in doesn't fix the problem, then the international community pours in more water. Well, all that water does is it often further widens the cracks in the community, and it also depletes the bottle. But the cup itself is invisible in the international system. It's like we don't see the community itself, much less the work of repairing the cracks of the community. And what we found is that when you repair the cracks in the community, that means when you reknit the community, bring them together again, valuing the resources that are there, the capacity that's there, and bring them together to lead the process. That not only does that repair the cup and they can then receive and hold water, any aid that comes from the outside, but actually that cup turns into a well and it can tap into reserves of groundwater right in the community itself. So all of these communities, so for example, Dabu that I told the story where Michael and Marianne lived, after their bonfire, their community cup was repaired, then they started saying, well, what do we want to do? We want to rebuild our community center that was burned down in the war. They started a community farm and sold the food to raise money to rebuild their community center, to buy the zinc for the roof. They made bricks from the dirt of their community and did the labor of rebuilding their community center themselves. They took up other collective improvement projects, and this happened all across the country. When you repair the cup, the people themselves could start doing the work of meeting their own needs and in incredible ways without even needing outside resources. What they needed outside resources for was to hold the space and to invite them to help reflect back to them the resources and the answers that are there, and to help facilitate the space that brought them back together and then invited them to act together to address their own their own challenges. So this is a real different way of working in the international community, in peace building and in development. And instead of working from the outside in, where you assume that the resources are on the outside and that the need is on the inside in the communities themselves. And when you make those assumptions, the aid flows one way. It flows from the outside in. If you see the strength and the capacity and the resources that are there, if you see their culture and their community is valuable, if you know that people like Michael and Mariama and thousands of other people like them have the desire and the courage to face their problems, have the capacity to work together, have the understanding of what their real issues are themselves, they can define them themselves. If you understand them, those resources, you want to work from the inside out. You want to work in ways which acknowledge the resources, the potential, and help build on it and share that wisdom and knowledge with those elsewhere and build from the inside out. And that is the approach that we've brought to our work from the beginning. And the work in Sierra Leone has grown to such an extent that, well, in the reconciliation process, Fumble Talk facilitated over 250 of these community bonfires, encompassing over 2,500 villages with over 150,000 people participating. So a massive process nationally that has reinvigorated putting people and community at the center of recovering from war. As we built upon that, and then in the middle of our working together, Sierra Leone faced the Ebola epidemic, and helping those same rebuilt communities, repaired cups, lead the way in responding to Ebola. We helped build that up to a national policy where the government has recognized the way in which what ordinary people are capable of doing, what its own people are capable of doing. And when you help repair communities and let people lead what's possible, they've built their whole national development process now around this way of working. And so Fumble Talk's work over the course of 15 years has built to the national government level. And the government is now leading the way and saying, we're putting people and communities at the center of our development. And it's this incredible global example that is now leading the way globally. Everybody knows that our system is broken, that it's not working the way it's meant to be. And we want to do better, but we don't always know how. And what's happened in Sierra Leone is this amazing example of what's possible. So it's a beacon in that way, but it also requires those of us who support the work from the outside to work differently. It requires us to go in not as experts, but as learners. And it requires us to commit to things over the long term and not just short term, not to just look at things that are measurable and tangible, but to understand the value of things that are often intangible, relationships, community building processes. Because like the cup, when it's repaired, it opens up the way for so much else. Sometimes it's these intangible processes that actually lead the most tangible change.
I find that so fascinating, and how that all comes together in many ways kind of counterintuitive to how nonprofits have worked in the past, from my understanding.
It's very counterintuitive. And what I describe is that the system as it is right now is outside in. And the system that we were building and living into and growing in Sierra Leone and growing from there is an inside out system. And an outside in system, first of all, is hierarchical and fragmented. You often hear about top down and bottom up. Well, that assumes a hierarchy, and that the alternative to a top down approach where all the power is at the government level and it's just being imposed on people at the grassroots assumes that the alternative is bottom up, right? So start at the grassroots and work up to the government level. But that still has embedded in it this idea, this hierarchy that some people, that misses the way in which actually the centers of power are in people and in local communities. And the challenge that we face as an international community and as people who are committed to being humanitarian helpers in whatever way is, how do we work in ways that help acknowledge the potential of people and mobilize and build on it? That's a really different orientation than how do I come in as an expert? How do I come in as a learner? We have to shift the way we work. I know for me, as somebody who's been facilitating this and also funding this work, it's required me to commit as much to my own learning and change and growth and development, both individually and organizationally, as I am interested in supporting and helping work in Sierra Leone. And so, yes, it's a completely different way of working. And I think there's a real challenge that this lived example in Sierra Leone has to us in the international community, which is how can we take more responsibility for our own learning and own transformation? There's a poem by Rumi that I opened my book with. Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. I think that's such a just absolutely resonant, powerful, true idea that, if we really want to make a contribution in the world, we have to be as willing to be transformed as we want to support others' transformation. And I know that's been a huge part of my own learning journey.
I love that quote. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so impactful because isn't that the truth? We all want to change everything outside, but it's really our own perspective and ourselves that we need to look at.
It is. And if I can bring it home in just a very personal way, I think, so oftentimes people that go into this kind of what we might call the caring professions or the helping professions, humanitarian work, right? We have huge hearts, a huge desire to support others. And oftentimes in the culture of the work, I think, and the system, it's like, it's so much easy to exhaust ourselves in the process. And unless and until we can it's like, if we are exhausting ourselves, we're participating in a system that actually sanctions the depletion of individuals. We don't want to participate in a system like that. That's not the goal of our work. So for me, as a leader, I found myself several years into this work where I had been pouring out myself, the financial resources, but also my time and energy, my heart, my soul, everything, pouring everything into this work. And I felt like I had just poured myself out. And we were at this major juncture in the work where the work in Sierra Leone was going forward. And I found myself exhausted and depleted and saying, what's next for me as a leader? What's next for us as an organization? And like, I didn't have anything else left to do it. And I ended up calling together a group of trusted folks, people that I knew well and trusted, and convening a retreat for me. I had convened all these retreats for John and for Fumble Talk, and never once had I convened anything to support my own leadership. And I didn't have a choice. I had to do that. And so I brought together this group of people to support me, which, oh my gosh, just the courage that took. And I had people reflecting back to me during this week-long retreat things that they saw as my unique strengths, as our unique strengths, and to receive that positive mirroring from others. I didn't want to be in the middle in that way. I wanted to be on the edges. It was uncomfortable for me to hear that, like, to receive that good, positive mirroring from people. It was like I was physically uncomfortable, but I had to do it. I had to learn how to receive support from others. I had to learn how to see myself the way others could see me. And it was in this weird way, it was so much harder to receive support from others than it was to offer it. But at a certain point, I couldn't go forward until I learned how to do that. It was so humbling. I ended up from that retreat forming an ongoing circle of these folks that I called my wisdom circle. And it took time and dedicated focus to create a space where I could receive support from others. And that transformed the way that I lead and a sense of direction with the work that we were taking, the direction for our work going forward from there. And I just have made a commitment to work in ways where there's that balance of giving and receiving. And, even, and maybe it's even especially as a funder, I think one of the things that I've learned is that if I can't be present with my vulnerability also, then I'm not really participating in a system that is actually about transformation. I'm just, in a lot of ways, perpetuating control from the outside. And I've seen how hard it is to accept support and how much is possible when and as we do. And it's transformed my ability to be a leader to the degree that I'm willing and able to put in really strong support structures for myself also in that process. And it's just ironic how in that way it's harder sometimes to receive than it is to give.
I hear that often.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to a place where people feel uncomfortable, but I'm sure that's where all the growth happens.
It is where all the growth happens. And it's hard, sometimes I think again for those of us who are either policymakers or funders in the international arena, those positions have been structured in ways where we can imagine that we're separate from the work that we're supporting. And this is where it goes back to what I said at the beginning, Marianne, is that actually this space where the individual transformation meets the global, that's the nugget, that's the nexus of real change. So when we are able to support transformation from a space that includes us in that. And positive way that I talk about this is thinking about what is the system that we want. I want a system that supports people stepping into their full potential. And I want that because that's as true for the villagers in rural Sierra Leone as it is for me, an international expert and funder. I want a space where I can step into my full potential. I want a space where John Cocker, the Sierra Leonean leader of Fumble Talk, can step into his full potential. I want a space where Lillian Morsay, one of the national staff members in Fumble Talk, can step into her full potential. I want a space where Fatim Mansoure can step into her full potential. And she's one of what they call the Peace Mothers in Sierra Leone, who started in a village and has stepped into national level leadership in Sierra Leone through this process. I want to participate in a system where we're all able to step into our full potential. And when we can look at it like that, and I can want the same thing for me that I want for somebody, for a rural woman in Sierra Leone in a village, then that's a healthy and whole system, I think, in a lot of ways. And it counterintuitive and yet so deeply intuitive at the same time, counter to everything that we've been taught. And it makes so much sense at another level.
Well, Libby, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your book? The answers are there.
So my author website is libbyhoffman.com, and that will give you all the information about the book. And I just want to say one thing about it, which is, one of my favorite reviews of the book was a friend of mine who's actually a professional dancer, so not at all connected to this work. And she said, after she read my book, she said, it gave me hope. And I think the stories of what's been possible in Sierra Leone and also the stories of individual transformation of everybody, including my own that I share in the book, are the kinds of stories that just give us hope. So for anybody yearning for hope and yearning for a different understanding of what's possible that we can step into that can inspire us wherever we're located, I think the book offers a lot of rich and fertile ground for that. So libbyhoffman.com. And then my organization is called Catalyst for Peace, catalystforpeace.org. And we've produced a feature film about Fumble Talk's work. And you can find links to watch that film also, which is another vivid way to learn about these powerful stories of what's happened in Sierra Leone and the new imaginative possibilities that I think it invites us all into.
Well, Libby, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's been just such a pleasure. These are among my favorite things to just talk about. So thank you for giving me the space to share some of what I'm excited about and what I've learned in this process.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us here, Libby. I learned a lot about peace building initiatives and how they really work. And I'm so grateful that we got to spend this time together today to talk about your new book, The Answers Are There: Building Peace from the Inside Out. The Answers Are There is available to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. And remember, support our indie bookstores. Again, if you'd like to connect with Libby, you can at libbyhoffman.com for more information on her work, how to be part of her community, and learn more about her book. So are you inspired by this book and looking for other great reads? Make sure to visit the Moments with Marianne book club at mariannepastana.com, where we have books and discussions that are here to empower you on your path. If you have a book suggestion, please reach out to us at mariannepastana.com. We want to hear from you. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.